Hi, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication is a really big topic, and there are a lot of wonderful resources out there. It comes from Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, and he has many excellent books. I highly recommend this one, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. It's a wonderful book, but there's also great resources out there through his videos, through articles, and through podcasts. So today we are going to be just looking at part one of nonviolent communication, and that is going to be telling us about what nonviolent communication is not. But before we get into that, I want to introduce you to a concept if you haven't come across it already. And this concept is the concept of praxis. So usually we end up in this circular way of thinking where we are, well, it's actually kind of more linear. It's drawn in a circle here, but when you think about it, it's more linear. We think that what we think is going to end up with a result. And oftentimes we keep thinking the same thing and it keeps ending up with the same results. And we tweak that thing just a little bit and we still end up with the same results. And so we tweak it again and it ends up with the same results. And so nonviolent communication is about breaking that cycle. And there are many different approaches that you'll talk about throughout your career in working with children or teaching or parenting, where we are encountering these moments where what we thought we were doing and what we're actually doing conflict. So, praxis is a really more elegant way, I guess, of saying, and I'm going to move my video screen here a little bit so you can see it better. It's a way of saying what I think and what I do need to be connected. So I think or I believe or I have a goal of some kind. And then that is going to translate into an action. I'm going to do something. I'll have a method of working with people or speaking to people or listening to people. And then I might pull back and reflect and think, okay, what I'm doing is supporting what I believe. Or maybe I'll notice a disconnection and I'll notice that what I'm doing is undermining my thinking. And so that's an opportunity to for praxis and to try and find a way that I can take these disconnected things and reconnect them. And sometimes just noticing that can be very vulnerable. And so we can revert to that other side of the screen again and say, "Oh, well, it worked enough," or "It worked on me as a kid," or I don't think there's any other options. And so we get stuck in that cycle of the same old thinking and the same old results. So today, when we talk about nonviolent communication and what it's not, we might encounter some moments of praxis where we notice, okay, wait a minute, but I thought that was the way I was supposed to do it. And then we might also fall into that wonderful feeling of vulnerability that makes us kind of want to run the other way. So, nonviolent communication might align with some of the things that you already believe, which is wonderful. And it'll make it a little bit easier to adapt that new mindset and to move towards a new result. But there will be things that stand in our way. So, part of what stands in our way is that misunderstanding of what nonviolent communication is. So, we're going to take that apart today. So, nonviolent communication, what it is not. Why nonviolent communication? Nobody's thinking, I'm going to speak to people violently today. Hopefully, we don't work with children in a violent way. That's not acceptable, right? Speaking to people in violent ways seems like something that we wouldn't do. It's not all communication appears violent. When we think about violent communication, we think about this picture here with the adult yelling down at a small child. That to me seems violent, right? But violence can look many different ways. So, being able to see or hear a language of dominance is what nonviolent communication can be. The language of dominance is that language we already speak. So, Marshall Rosenberg isn't saying that the language you already speak is violent. He's saying it's not nonviolent. And it looks different in many different cultures, but there is this way that we speak to ourselves and to others, including small children, that relies on a story, a narrative, something that's not really real. Um, that there needs to be someone in control at all times. And sometimes this manifests through different practices. So remember, we're thinking about theory and then the practice. And the we think, we're being supportive and kind people who are hopefully raising children who are respectful and responsible and honest and like have autonomy and want to share and want to be kind and all those things. We're trying to pass down these wonderful values and characteristics that we more or less agree on, and yet we use different tactics that distract from that. So I love this picture here. It makes me think of some different tactics, where we might use some kind of mind trick to unfortunately manipulate the people that we're working with, or even manipulate ourselves into not grabbing that piece of chocolate or into saying I can have that last piece of chocolate in my case today. But yeah, using some kind of tactic to trick people into doing what we want them to do. That might look like a bribe, for example. You finish all the vegetables on your plate, and we'll talk about dessert. You get your room clean first, and then you can have your screen time. Then we think about the taskmaster. Let's get everybody organized. Let's get them things that they can do. And when they do all of those things, they're going to reach a reward at the end. I do that with myself as well. I thought I'm going to do all of these things and then I'm going to grab myself a chocolate, which I haven't yet finished. So we've got some ideas around how we can get people to do what we want them to do. There's the look. I'm sure you've all used it. I have a very good look that I can give to people. And that look can communicate to people what I want them to do through my disdain, right? And then this other idea of Wolfie to the rescue. This child is crying. I want them to stop crying. I want them to do what I want them to do, which is stop crying, stop having this emotional outburst. And so I might distract them with fun or play rather than communicating or dialoguing through an issue. So being able to see or hear a language of dominance is part of the nonviolent communication approach. And so we're going to dissect a little bit of that story of dominance so that we can start to be able to see and hear it in a more effective way. So, also with nonviolent communication, there's this idea that we're going to develop a consciousness of alternatives. Nonviolent communication is just one alternative, but in our language of dominance, we don't have an alternative. There's only one way to do it, and all other possibilities won't work. And we'll get into that a little bit more with a story I'm going to tell you. And so, nonviolent communication brings us to this point where we start asking, how do I make this person's day more wonderful? Or how do I make this moment more wonderful? How do I make this interaction more wonderful? How do I make my day more wonderful? And that is where it turns into something quite empowering rather than permissive. And in the language of dominance, there is only power and permissiveness. In nonviolent communication, there is a language of compassion. So it's really ends up being how do we find common ground rather than building that wall and separating ourselves? How do we find common ground and reach a moment of reconciliation? Okay, so we've got our Jedi mind tricks and all of that, and we've got this confusion between what we're saying and what we're doing. And so we start to ask ourselves, okay, so if I am doing all these things, what language am I speaking? And we start really focusing on the words that we think we're saying. So, as I said before, Marshall Rosenberg calls this a language of dominance, but he also calls it a language of right and wrong. I'm trying to communicate how I'm right and how you're wrong, or you're trying to communicate how you're right and how I'm wrong. And again, we're limited in possibilities when the options are only right or wrong. So, how do we expand our possibilities through communication? It's also a language of too much and too little. You're being too loud for my ears right now. We are moving too fast. You've eaten too little of your breakfast. So there's a lot of judgment based in this idea of right and wrong. There's a lot of judgment based in this idea of too little and too much. And both of these ideas feed this language of dominance, this role of dominance. And nonviolent communication is about breaking that down and noticing when we're speaking that language that really interrupts our goal of connection. We also focus a lot on what we say in a language of dominance. Well, this is what I said to him. And I didn't intend for this to be meant in this way or to be for the impact to be this impact. This is what I said. Or we think really clearly about what we're saying. Okay, I'm going to use I statements and I messages. I don't like the way that you abandoned me at the store is not an I message in the sense that Marshall Rosenberg means it in a nonviolent communication, how it is meant. So there's a lot of focus on what we say, but that's not all that's happening here. Communication is a two-way street. It's also what we hear, what the other person hears, and what we hear. And so in nonviolent communication, we work on translating what other people are saying into what's called giraffe. So we'll get into that idea of jackal and giraffe, the dominant language, or the language of dominance, sorry, and the language of the giraffe in just a few moments. And then lastly, we really focus on this question of how do I get them to do what I want them to do? This is the big distractor. It should have blinking lights all around it. Often that's what sneaks into my mind when I find myself speaking jackal, when find myself leaning into that language of dominance. I'm really trying to get someone else to do what I want them to do. And isn't that the point a lot of the time? Trying to get the kids to line up, trying to get the kid into the car, trying to get the kid to put on their boots. I have to get them to do what I want them to do. Nonviolent communication is not about communication. What? Nonviolent communication is not about communication. It is about connection. So that is something we should acknowledge when we think about what nonviolent communication is not. It's not a language that is meant to just be about what we are saying and doing and hearing. It's also about a mindset shift. So I want to start by bringing up a story here, a story we all know. This is a story that you've lived your entire life. You're still going to live your entire life. I live it too. It's all around us. It's built into the institutions in which we live and have to work with. And it's built into our relationships. And it's something we can resist. And this story comes from a guy named Hegel who wrote in the 1600s. And I shorten it to the MSD, but that stands for the master slave dialectic. Dialectic meaning like the separation. So the master slave dialectic. And I'm going to tell it to you with crappy pictures. All right. So Hegel says that we start off as people who want to be fully self actualized, right? We want to fully realize our freedom to be human. And the only way, Hegel says, the only way to become fully self actualized, and that is our whole life goal, is to meet another person and see them as fully human too, and be seen by them as fully human. So these two people have not been recognized as fully human by another human being. And they're imagining this because that will self actualize them. And that's what their goal is. They're imagining what that might look like to see that other person and be seen by that other person. And then when they actually come face to face, they are not really sure what to do with it. They are uncomfortable. They feel a sense of vulnerability. And rather than recognizing each other as fully human, they fight to the death. So Hegel says these two beings enter into a fight to the death. And as they're fighting, they realize, or one of them realizes at least, that if they kill the other, then there'll be no one left to recognize them as fully human. And so then they'll be in that eternal problem of not being able to be recognized. And therefore, their goal will never be fulfilled. So instead of killing the other person, because that person who makes that realization is winning, instead, they make the other person the slave and they crown themselves the master. So the person with the crown, which is the squiggly line on top of their head, is the master. And the person on their knees looking sad with some hair, maybe, or sweat, like I said, these are crappy pictures, is going to be our slave. So we've entered into this dialectic of master and slave, but it doesn't end there. So, to keep somebody in the position of slave, we've got to get them to do some work, partly because that's now their role to serve us as a master, but partly because that is going to maintain the master's role as master. And what I mean by this is it's going to keep the slave in check. So the master is going to get them busy, get them working so they don't resist this role that they've been put into. And the master is going to need to invent some other ways to keep the slave in check so that they don't rise up. So, for example, there is a camera there. That's what that little blue thing with the red dot is. So, we're going to surveil, we're going to watch. Okay, I have eyes in the back of my head and I'm watching you. We're going to watch the slave and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and make sure they know that they're being watched. We're going to encourage the slave with some rewards. For example, the Slave of the Month poster could encourage them. And we'll do other things to confine them or keep them busy. Now, this doesn't really serve the master. This is pretty exhausting for the master, hence why the master has bags under their eyes. They no longer have a smile on their face. No one is really happy in this situation. It doesn't really serve anyone. It's a lot of work for both parties. No one is self actualized in this situation. And the control begets the need for more control. The response to control is inevitably resistance. And so we have to keep inventing new ways to manage the slave so that we can keep them in their place. And this results in, a couple stories. One, the master needs to keep telling themselves, well, if I didn't control the slave, then it would be chaos. So I kind of have to do that. They're just not capable of controlling themselves. And the master tells the story to the slave, or at least the slave interprets this whole thing as okay, but once I prove that I'm capable, once I prove that I'm good, then I can rise up and become a master too. Unfortunately, that is not the way that the story goes. There cannot be two masters. There has to be only master slave in the master slave dialectic. So neither person is self actualized. Both are living in fear. The master fears losing their position, and the slave fears injury or death or more subjugation. And neither are self actualized. The slave can't recognize the master as fully human when they do such inhuman things to them, when they dehumanize them. And the master obviously can't recognize the slave because to see them as fully human, they would have to elevate them out of that role and give up the role of master. So they're stuck. They're stuck in a dehumanizing dialectic that serves no one. Now, like I said before, resistance is inevitable. So perhaps the slave will rise up and they'll fight to the death again. And maybe this time the slave will win and the master will become the slave and the slave become the master. These are our only options. We go back and forth. It is not that the teacher or the child care worker or the parent or the boss is always the master. Anybody who's interacted with a child in the grocery store knows that very quickly we can go from this to this if we're playing this game. These are our only options and we can go back and forth. So that is an example of a language of dominance that I wanted to bring up because it really helps explain where this language of dominance comes from and the inner workings of it. It's hard to reflect and pull back and think about why we're doing what we're doing, why we play this game at all. But the game is told through us and has been told to us since the beginning of our lives. And it's told through us and to us through stories and movies, through institutions, and through relationships. But it is something that we can also resist. So this is the way we're picturing it a lot of the time. We're picturing it as, the parent or the caregiver is the one wearing the crown, and that maybe we're told in the story we all know that that's the way it should be. But we also know that that can be dehumanizing, and no one really wants to be that sort of leader. No one really wants to be that sort of teacher or parent either. But when we have an outsider watching us, we also don't want to be in the other situation where the kid is wearing the crown and we are the ones who have our head in our hands, not really knowing what to do and feeling quite powerless. No one wants to be powerless. No one wants to be dehumanized. And in the master slave dialectic, these are the only options. Within a language of dominance, the language of dominance is part of that game of master slave dialectic. So it supports that game. And that's all there is. That's all the only options there are. So dominance, that's a really scary word. No one wants to be the dominant one, especially when it comes to at Camosun, our idea of being humanizing in relationships with children. That's certainly not our goal. And so when we notice a word like dominance, or when we notice these roles, or when we pull back and take a moment, we think, oh my gosh, I'm living the master slave dialectic right now with this child. That's very vulnerable. And that is a good thing. It's time to lean in, and it means that we are disconnected from our beliefs and goals. So remember that word praxis? Vulnerability is that blinking light that's saying, hey, praxis is here. You have an opportunity for transformation. You have an opportunity to make change. And it's going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be some disbelief, and there's going to be some challenges here, but it's a moment where you could choose this. So, as I said before, we're going to come up against all of these stories, and all of these stories are going to make nonviolent communication seem impossible, make nonviolent communication seem really hard, make it seem like it won't work, make it seem like we're going to end up with chaos. So, we have to be able to see this language in order to even open our hearts a little bit to the idea of nonviolent communication and what other possibilities there might be. Keep having to move my picture around. All right. So, nonviolent communication is more than I statements, it's a mindset. And I think that this is where the discomfort lies for me, because I think often I hear people say, I'm using I statements, or I'm using I language with children. And so, therefore, I am not speaking this language of dominance. But an I statement does not a nonviolent communication make. There are some barriers occasionally within I statements, and we're going to dig into that in the next part of our in person workshop. So, we're going to start thinking about okay, maybe we can find a way to say something different than how do I get them to do what I want them to do? And this is what I mean by I statements being occasionally problematic. If your mindset is, how do I get them to do what I want them to do? And you use an I statement, you're still working from that mindset of dominance. We have to shift from this goal of how do I get them to do what I want them to do, regardless of whether the practice is using I statements or not, and open ourselves up to another possibility, letting go of that idea that I need to get them to do something and asking, how can I make life more wonderful for the both of us? This is not to say that children or anyone can do whatever the heck they want. That is certainly not in line with our values. That is certainly an opportunity for a lack of safety. That is certainly an area where the word permissive would fit quite well. Letting people do whatever they want, being a doormat to people is not what nonviolent communication is about. Instead, it's about pulling back and questioning, okay, do I really need this child to put these boots on? Okay, maybe I do need to get the child to put the boots on. How can I make life more wonderful for them so that the boots seem like a possible option? Do we just need to dialogue about these boots? Do we need to find an alternative to these boots? Do we just need to get some big emotions out and have a deep connection with the adult in our life so that we feel supported in putting on these boots? So when we turn our question into how do I make life more wonderful for the both of us, we turn our mindset towards that. It opens us up to other possibilities outside of dominance. But this does mean that we need to let go of a few things. So we're replacing this question of how do I get my kid, the kid, to do what I want them to do with connection. With connection with ourselves. So making sure that we are feeling um, comfortable and certain, and or leaning into that vulnerability and that uncertainty and discomfort, um, and doing that in a way that we feel connected. We are looking for connection with others. That's what our work is, to connect with others all day long and to connect with the world, our environment, both human made and natural, the world of ideas. So when we're encountering new ideas, when we're encountering new environments, when we're encountering concepts, rules, how do we stay connected? Let's notice some disconnection and work through it. So Marshall Rosenberg, who is the person who really articulated what nonviolent communication is, he does not say he invented it, because nonviolent communication is a language that humans have been speaking since time immemorial. And there are cultures that speak the language of nonviolence as their natural language, the language that they use. But within our um, varied Canadian culture, our shared language is unfortunately this language of dominance. And so he uses these two ideas of giraffe and jackal to express the two languages. And he also says that the purpose of nonviolent communication is to create a quality of connection with people that makes it enjoyable for us to contribute to each other's well being. He says the language that we're all speaking, all we're ever saying, is please and thank you. And we can say please and thank you in a language of dominance, and our needs are not very likely to be met. And we are not very likely to be meeting the needs of others. But when we speak with the language of nonviolence, we are creating a connection first that makes it enjoyable for others to meet our needs. We are inviting them to meet our needs through connection. And this supports our collective well being. So, like I said before, there is often a bit of a backfire effect when we're encountering a new concept. We might feel a sense of disconnection with this idea, and our brains will often send a threat signal to us, and we might feel a bit nervous or flush or vulnerable with this new concept. And that's really normal. It's really normal for our brain to have that limbic response and say, have no fear, I'll kill this new concept with swords. Um, and what I'm going to invite you to do is notice those feelings and feel those feelings, and listen to what those feelings are trying to tell you, because all feelings are communication. Are those feelings telling you that you are already feeling really strong in your communication and you're worried that your way of doing things might be put into question? Are you worried that this concept seems too difficult and you're not really sure you'll be able to follow along? Are you feeling like, oh, communication is really important to me and I want to do this? And so I'm feeling this sense of vulnerability as I encounter it. There are probably a few options out there. And I'm here. We're going to talk about it. So we're going to, in our synchronous workshop, dig into this nonviolent communication world. We're going to learn about putting on our giraffe ears and listening to what other people say, as well as turning our giraffe ears inward and listening to our own hearts and what's being said inside. And I love how Marshall Rosenberg speaks to nonviolent communication and this giraffe language as an opportunity to never hear criticism again. Could you imagine never hearing criticism again? So, that is what we're going to be digging into with nonviolent communication. And we're going to do this with the consideration that the world, as most of us know it, is jackal. And we're going to talk about the role that a jackal has in the way that we interpret, the way that we judge, the way that this disconnects us, the way that we introduce strategies in order to get what we want people to do to happen, and the way that we make demands, even in a really nice way with I statements. Demands can be made. When we shift over to giraffe, we observe without judgment or evaluation, observing ourselves and others without judgment or evaluation. So that's where that lack of criticism finally comes in. We consider feelings and how we're connected or disconnected. We consider needs of ourselves and others. And we make requests of each other. Will we always get our needs met? No. Will we always meet the needs of others? Absolutely not. But another really important part of nonviolent communication is empathy and generosity. And being committed to that connection with each other and empathizing and generosity is really more likely to get us where we want to go than disconnection, judgment, the game of who's right and wrong, and really focusing on how to get others to do what we want them to do. And you know this already through your life experience. Nonviolent communication invites us to enter into the dance of communication. Everyone hold everyone's needs as equal, use observations, avoiding interpretations, be curious about others, give and receive empathy, be vulnerable, letting go of defenses, be flexible with strategies, experience transformation so as to emerge someplace new, all in the name of creating connection. Doesn't that sound appealing to us? Can we let go of the language of dominance? So, my child wanted to know what it is I do all day when I'm here in my office talking to a screen. And I showed him some slides of the master slave dialectic. And at the end of it, he said, Mommy, this is really confusing. I don't understand why the master and slave are still talking. They can't hear each other. They're too far apart. And he held up his hands and he did little talking hands, like he was each hand was calling into the abyss. And he said all they have to do is come down to each other and see each other and hear each other. And I think that that's a really nice way of talking about nonviolent communication. But it's hard because we do get pulled apart over and over and over again. So, how do we emerge someplace new, all in the name of creating that connection? So, I want you to come prepared to the workshop with a couple things. I want you to think about a moment when someone made your life a little less than wonderful. A moment when someone made your life a little less than wonderful. Does not need to be related, my light's about to fall, does not need to be related to childcare, but it would be helpful if it is. What was said and what did you hear? What did you say? What did the other person say? And what did you hear? Because you might have heard something different than what was said. What emotions were present? Your presence, your emotions, the other person's emotions, acknowledged emotions, unacknowledged emotions, emotions in retrospect. What needs were present? Acknowledged or unacknowledged needs. And what was the outcome of this situation when someone made your life less wonderful? Now, this is a very vulnerable activity, and feel free to choose an example where you think, all right, I can see this master slave dialectic happening in this, because we're going to take this moment and work through it and see if we can modify it so that it's nonviolent, and work on how to deconstruct and communicate those moments. Because even once we start speaking nonviolent communication and start are living that mindset, other people around us, are they all going to go giraffe? Not right away, and sometimes never, right? We're going to hear jackal all around us. So during our workshop, you will meet my jackal, and we'll talk some jackal. We'll have conversations with the jackal, and we will try and speak giraffe, and get a little bit of practice. All right. So thanks so much for meeting with me. I'm really looking forward to our in-person on Zoom meeting that's coming up. And if you have any questions before that, or if you want to run your story idea by me about when somebody made your life less wonderful, please feel free to contact me via email, or through our D2L, and I will bounce my ideas back and forth with you. Other than that, good luck.